The city breathed its neon sigh far below the penthouse terrace, a mechanical exhalation of light and sound that did nothing to warm the chill clinging to Elara James. Inside, the silence was a different creature, thick, expensive, and heavy as the velvet drapes that framed a view she could not see. Her fingers, usually so expressive, tracing the air as she scat, lay limp on the silk of her ivory gown. It was a prison uniform masquerading as couture. The scent of gardenias from the massive, unwanted bouquet on the lacquered console table was cloying, a funeral perfume for the vivacious part of her soul that had, just hours ago, felt so dangerously alive. That memory was a physical ache. The basement jazz club, the blue mirage, swam behind her eyes. The air had been thick with cigarette smoke and yearning, the only kind of church she'd ever truly believed in. She'd closed her eyes, gripped the mic stand and let the pain out. It had poured from her not as a scream, but as a molten honey-dark river of sound. A Billie Holiday lament twisted through with her own raw, modern fury. The crowd had vanished. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, there had been no debts, no desperate mother's pleas, no future she didn't choose. There had only been the vibration in her throat, the truth in the notes, and the fleeting, terrifying sensation of absolute freedom. That was her last supper. The memory was already curdling. Now, she stood in the cavernous living room of a man she had met exactly once. A man whose name, Ji-Hoon Kim, felt like a stone in her mouth. The meeting had been a study in oppressive elegance, a private dining room where the cutlery seemed to judge her. Her family had been all tense smiles and hopeful eyes, their relief at the salvation he represented so palpable it smelled like sweat beneath their perfume. His family, austere and watchful, spoke in low Korean that her mother couldn't understand but whose dismissive tone needed no translation. And him. He was the still point in the center of the storm. He had not leered. He had not preened. Dressed in a suit that seemed carved from shadow, he had simply observed. His eyes, dark and unreadable as polished river stones, had taken her in, not her body she felt but her entirety. The defiant set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands she hid in her lap, the way her spirit seemed to vibrate just beneath her skin like a captured hummingbird. When the formalities were concluded, her father had nudged her to speak. The words had boiled over, a last-ditch effort to assert some scrap of self. "You should know," she had said, her voice trembling with a courage she didn't feel, directing it at the impassive man across the table. "You can force this wedding. You can buy me. But you can't make me scream for you." It was a crude, desperate weapon, flung from a place of profound powerlessness. She meant it to shock, to wound, to paint him as the villain her mind needed him to be. The table had frozen. Her mother had gasped. His mother had sniffed in disdain. Ji-Hoon Kim had merely set his porcelain teacup down onto its saucer without a sound. Then he lifted his gaze to hers. The silence stretched, taut enough to snap. When he spoke, his voice was low, calm, a bass note that vibrated in the marrow more than the ear. It held no anger, no offense, only a profound and unsettling certainty. "I have no interest in your screams, Elara," he said, her name sounding foreign and precise on his tongue. "I am interested in your silence." The statement had knocked the breath from her lungs more effectively than any shout. It was an answer she could not parse, a door closing on the expected narrative and revealing a strange, dark hallway beyond. He had not taken the bait. He had changed the entire game. The wedding was a blur of white orchids, solemn vows in 2 languages she barely comprehended, and the cold, smooth weight of a diamond band on her finger. She moved her things, a singer's wardrobe of sequins and soft cotton, her well-loved vinyl records, a single framed photo of her and her grandmother, into his penthouse. It was architectural perfection. Sleek lines, muted tones, art that was abstract and cold. It felt like a museum. A very sterile, very quiet museum. On that first night, he had carried her suitcase, not her, pointedly, to a bedroom down the hall from the master. The room was beautiful, impersonal, a high-end hotel suite. He stood at the doorway, a tall, quiet silhouette against the hall light. "This is your space," he had said, his voice still that same maddeningly even tone. "It is yours alone. The lock is on the inside." Then he was gone, his footsteps silent on the polished concrete floors. The click of the master bedroom door closing was the period at the end of his sentence. She was not to be claimed tonight. Perhaps not ever in the way she had braced for. The relief was immediate, then confusing, then somehow more frightening. What did he want? What did his interest in her silence mean? Was it a threat? A promise? A kind of torturous patience? She wandered the main living area, her bare feet soundless on the cool floor. She trailed her fingers over the spine of art books, examined a stark sculpture of twisted metal. There was no music here. No television. Only one door was locked. A heavy, reinforced door off the study. His private studio, she assumed. The inner sanctum. Elara walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The city twinkled, indifferent. She was 26. Her voice, which had been her compass, her weapon, her solace, felt stuck in her throat. She had traded it and herself for her family's security. She was a bird in a gilded cage, yes, but the most unsettling part was that her new keeper seemed content to simply watch her from the other side of the bars, making no move to open the door or to reach inside. He was waiting. But for what? Her silence. What did that even mean? In the profound quiet of her new prison, the only sound was the frantic, unanswered beating of her own heart, a rhythm section with no song to follow, playing a terrified solo ad-lib into the abyss. Days bled into one another within the minimalist confines of the penthouse, each sunrise over the city skyline a silent taunt of a world continuing on without her. Elara moved through the spaces like a ghost, her presence seemingly absorbed by the concrete walls and the vast, echoing quiet. Ji-Hoon was a phantom schedule. He left at precisely 7:30 each morning, the soft snick of the apartment door his only farewell. He returned at 7 in the evening, the same discreet sound announcing his return. He would often find her curled on the vast sectional sofa, a book unopened in her lap, staring at nothing. He would offer a slight, formal nod. Elara. Her name, never more, never less. Then he would retreat to the kitchen, emerging later with a simple, impeccably plated meal, grilled fish, steamed vegetables, rice, setting one before her before taking his own seat at the far end of the dining table. They ate in a silence so profound the scrape of chopsticks on porcelain sounded like a violation. Her own room, her supposed sanctuary, began to feel like a cell. The locked door across the hall, however, became an obsession. It was the only part of him, of this sterile life, that was inaccessible, and therefore the only part that seemed to hold any truth. What did he do in there? What required such secrecy? Her imagination conjured all manner of dark possibilities, each more outlandish than the last, fueled by the enigma of his calm and her own powerlessness. The mystery of that door became a stand-in for the mystery of the man himself, and she found she could no longer abide either. One Wednesday, fueled by a restless defiance that had been building like steam in a kettle, she acted. She waited until she heard the soft click of the main door signaling his departure. She gave it 10 minutes, then 20, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, she slipped out, following the route she had vaguely discerned from the building directory. The morning was crisp, the city's bustle a shocking assault on senses dulled by days of quiet. The walk was 15 minutes to a renovated warehouse district where old brick met modern glass. And there it was, Kim Atelier. The name was etched in discreet steel on a frosted glass door. She didn't dare enter. Instead, she found a dim alleyway across the narrow street, a vantage point partially obscured by a dumpster and a fire escape. Through the large, street-level window she could see into a portion of the space. It was not a sterile office. It was a workshop, but one of such organized reverence it felt like a secular chapel. Shelves held rows of raw, gray clay forms. Wooden tables were lined with tools whose purposes she couldn't guess. And in the center of the light pouring from a high window he sat. Ji-Hoon was at a potter's wheel. He had shed the corporate armor of his suits. He wore a simple clay-stained linen shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His head was bowed in concentration. The transformation was absolute. The impassive, distant man from the penthouse was gone. In his place was a figure of such intense, focused vitality it stole the air from her lungs. His shoulders, usually held with such rigid control, were relaxed yet powerful. His hands were everything. They were caked in wet, gray slurry, yet they moved with a precision that was almost agonizingly beautiful. The wheel spun, a low rhythmic hum she could almost feel from across the street. The mound of clay obeyed him, not through force, but through a dialogue of incredible subtlety. The pads of his thumbs pressed inward, creating a hollow. His fingers, long and strong, coaxed the walls upward, thinning them with a pressure so consistent it seemed telepathic. One hand was inside the emerging vessel, the other cradling the outside, their partnership perfect, intimate. He wasn't just making a pot. He was conducting a silent symphony with earth and motion. A lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead, ignored. His entire being was poured into the conversation between his hands and the spinning clay. She saw for the first time passion in Ji-Hoon Kim. It was a quiet, consuming fire, and it was devastating to witness. She stood there, hidden in the alley's gloom, for an hour. He never looked up. He centered new lumps of clay, threw them with a practiced, fluid motion, shaped bowls, vases, forms that grew tall and elegant from nothing. The world outside, the traffic, the city's din, her own tangled misery, ceased to exist. There was only this man and his silent creation. That evening the penthouse felt different. The silence was no longer just an absence. It was now filled with the phantom memory of that spinning wheel, the image of his focused face. When he came home, his nod seemed to carry the residue of that other self. She saw the faint, dusty trace of clay under his fingernails, a crack in the facade of his pristine world. He moved to go to his studio door as he always did after dinner, but he paused, his hand on the handle. He didn't look at her, but his voice, when it came, was the same, yet somehow altered by her new knowledge. "The city can be disorienting," he said, his gaze on the locked door. "If you are curious, you may enter here. Do not be afraid of the mess." With a soft click, he unlocked it, pushed it open a fraction, and then continued into his bedroom, leaving the door to his secret world ajar. An invitation or a test? Days passed. She didn't go in. The open door was more intimidating than the locked one. But the memory of his hands haunted her. The stifling quiet of her own existence became unbearable. One afternoon, a reckless, frustrated energy took hold. She would bake. She would fill this sterile place with the smell of sugar and butter, a sensation of home. She raided the pristine, underused kitchen, throwing ingredients together for a cake she only half remembered her grandmother making. Flour dusted the black countertops like snowfall. Eggshells glittered in the sink. A bottle of vanilla extract slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tile floor, its sweet, pungent scent exploding into the air. She was on her knees, trying to gather the sticky, sharp pieces with trembling hands, tears of frustration mingling with the mess on her cheeks, when she sensed him. He stood in the doorway, having returned home early. He took in the scene, the flour-clouded air, the batter-smeared bowls, the gleaming shards of glass, and her, kneeling in the center of it all, a portrait of glorious, defeated chaos. For a long moment he was still. Then, without a word, he walked to the utility closet, pulling out a broom, a dustpan, a roll of paper towels. He knelt beside her, not too close. He carefully swept up the larger fragments. His movements were efficient, unhurried. When he reached for a piece near her hand, his fingers brushed against hers. It was the first intentional skin-to-skin contact since he had slid the ring onto her finger. A jolt, sharp and clear as a struck bell, traveled up her arm. She froze. He did too, his hand recoiling as if burned. He looked at her then, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw not anger or annoyance, but a flash of something far more vulnerable, surprise, and a mirror of the electric shock she felt. His usual composure was gone, replaced for a fractured second by a naked, human astonishment. He recovered quickly, his mask settling back into place, but the crack had been seen. He finished cleaning in silence, stood, and disposed of the debris. He washed his hands at the sink, his back to her. When he turned, his face was neutral again, but his voice held a new, low note. "You sing," he stated. It wasn't a question. He had heard her, those first nights, humming to herself in her room, the sound barely a whisper. "You should not stop." Then he left her there, standing in the wreckage of the kitchen, the ghost of his touch on her skin and the weight of his unexpected words hanging in the vanilla-scented air. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was now charged, waiting, filled with the unspoken memory of spinning clay and the electric truth of a single accidental touch. The open door to his studio became a physical presence in the apartment, a silent question mark carved into the wall. For 3 days, Elara ignored it, treating its threshold like a line drawn in invisible ink. She busied herself with the minutiae of a life in suspension, organizing the records she never played, folding clothes with excessive care, her gaze perpetually pulled back to that dark rectangle. The kitchen incident had changed the atmospheric pressure in the penthouse. The silence was no longer a void, it was a charged field, humming with the unsaid. His words, "You should not stop," echoed in the quiet corners, a permission she hadn't known she needed, a command that felt oddly like a gift. On the 4th day, curiosity and a desperate need to understand the source of the passion she had witnessed overcame pride and fear. She stood before the doorway, took a breath that did not steady her, and crossed over. It was not the pristine, gallery-like space she had imagined from the penthouse's aesthetic. This was a world of elemental process. The air smelled of damp earth, of minerals, of clean dust. Light streamed in from a high window, catching motes of clay floating in lazy suspension. One wall was lined with raw materials, bags of different clays, buckets of glazes with cryptic labels. Another held shelves of works in progress, ghostly bisque-fired pieces awaiting color, and others, glossy and finished, in deep celadone greens, iron-rich blacks, and the blush of a perfect peach. In the center stood his wheel, a sentinel, its splash pan stained with the history of 1,000 creations. And there he was, at a long wooden table, meticulously carving an intricate pattern into the leather-hard surface of a large bowl with a needle-like tool. He did not look up as she entered, but a slight loosening in his shoulders indicated her presence was noted and permitted. She wandered, her fingers hovering but not touching, over the objects on the shelves. The forms were breathtaking in their elegant simplicity, each curve suggesting a profound understanding of balance, of containment. She stopped before a tall, slender vase, its surface a perfect, unbroken milky white. "It is waiting," his voice came, calm and low, from behind her. She started, turning. He had not moved from his table, but his eyes were on her. "The first firing sets its shape. The glaze firing will give it its voice. Now it is only potential." She nodded, unsure how to respond to the poetry of the statement. Her eyes drifted back to the wheel. "Will you?" she began, then cleared her throat. "Will you work at the wheel today?" "If you wish to see," he replied, his tone neutral, offering no pressure. She did wish. She took a seat on a stool a respectful distance away, folding her hands in her lap. He rose, selected a lump of clay from a bin and sat at the wheel. The ritual began. He centered the clay with a physical, almost violent authority that was at odds with the gentleness to come, throwing it down, wetting his hands, forcing the spinning mound into perfect, still symmetry. Once achieved, his demeanor shifted. The creation began. As before, she was mesmerized by the dialogue between his hands and the emerging form. The room was so quiet she could hear the soft, wet friction of his fingers on the clay, the steady hum of the wheel's motor. After a long while, as he was smoothing the rim of a graceful bowl with a damp sponge, he spoke, his eyes still on his work. "You have not sung." It was not an accusation. It was an observation as clinical as noting the humidity of the clay. Yet it felt like a challenge. "It doesn't feel right here," she said, the words leaving her before she could stop them. "The quiet is too complete. It feels like a sin to break it." For the first time since she'd entered, his hands stilled on the wheel. He let it slow to a stop. He looked at her, his gaze deep and assessing. "Sound is not an interruption of silence," he said slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "It is its companion. The kiln is silent until it reaches the temperature where the clay and glaze fuse. That transformation has its own music if one knows how to listen. Sing. Let me hear the music that is in you." The directness of the request, framed in his peculiar artistic logic, dismantled her last defense. The studio, with its smell of earth and its evidence of fearless creation, felt like the only honest place in her world. She closed her eyes, not to block him out, but to find the thread of a song in the new, strange stillness of this room. She began low, a hum that was almost part of the wheel's residual vibration. Then words emerged, an old spiritual, "wade in the water," but she pulled it apart, slowed it to a molasses crawl, infused it with a blues ache that came straight from the marrow of her current loneliness. Her voice, unaccompanied, was a raw, vulnerable thing in the space. It wrapped around the shelves of pottery, bounced off the high ceiling, and settled like a fine mist over everything. When she finished, the last note fading into the clay dust air, she opened her eyes. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but his hands, she noticed, were perfectly still, resting on his knees. He gave a single, slow nod. Then, without a word, he stood and walked to the bin of clay. He returned with a fresh, cool, gray lump and placed it on the table before her. "Your turn," he said. "I can't," she laughed, a short, nervous sound. "You can," he stated. "It is only earth. It has no expectations." He guided her to the wheel, adjusting the stool for her. He stood behind her, not touching, and explained the basics. The pedal, the need for centering. Her first attempts were comical, disastrous. The clay wobbled, slipped, became a lopsided mess. Frustration bubbled in her throat. Then he moved. He sat on a lower stool beside her. "May I?" he asked, his hands hovering. She nodded, her throat tight. His large, capable hands covered hers, slick with slurry. His chest was a solid warmth against her shoulder. "Do not fight it," his voice murmured by her ear, a low vibration she felt as much as heard. "Feel its rhythm. Guide it." His hands applied pressure, hers beneath them learning the language of push and pull, of steady, confident coaxing. It was the most intimate act of her life. More than any kiss could have been. This was a communication of pure intention, of teaching and learning, of shared focus. Her world narrowed to the cold slip of clay, the enveloping heat of his body, the sure guidance of his hands. Under their combined touch, the clay ceased its rebellion. It rose, a small, simple but perfectly symmetrical cylinder. A breathless laugh escaped her, a sound of pure, startled joy. He slowly released her hands but remained close. "See," he said, and she could hear the faintest hint of satisfaction in his tone. "You have a touch." Weeks dissolved into a new, strange routine. Her days were no longer defined by empty waiting, but by anticipation of the hours in the studio. He taught her to wedge clay, to knead the air from it, her muscles aching with the effort. She sang while he worked. He began to create pieces that seemed to respond to her music. Taller, more lyrical forms when she sang soaring ballads, lower, wider bowls when she slipped into a somber jazz standard. They spoke little, but the studio was never silent. It was filled with the wet sound of clay, the hum of the wheel, the rasp of tools, and her voice. The outside world, however, had not disappeared. It arrived in the form of a formal dinner at his family's sprawling, traditional home in the hills. The evening was an exquisite torture of subtle criticisms masked as polite questions, of his mother's eyes lingering on Elara's unchanged flat stomach, of conversations in Korean that flowed around her like a cold river. She felt like a specimen, a curious, perhaps flawed, acquisition. The car ride home was glacial. The penthouse door had barely closed behind them before the dam broke. "Is that all I am to them?" she erupted, the silks of her dress suddenly suffocating. "A decorative piece? A broodmare? Did you hear her? When will the household be blessed? I'm not a damn incubator." Ji-Hoon stood by the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. When he turned, his face was a mask of stone, but his eyes held a storm. "And what are you to me, Elara?" The question was quiet, deadly. It stopped her rant cold. She had expected defensiveness, an apology for his family. Not this. "You tell me," she shot back, the fear twisting into anger. "Am I a duty? A social obligation? A vessel for your heir, just like one of your precious vases? Is that the final form you're shaping me into?" The words hung in the air, cruel and sharp. He flinched as if physically struck. The controlled facade shattered, revealing a raw, wounded fury she had never seen. "You think that is what this is?" His voice was a low, dangerous rasp. "You think the silence I wanted was the silence of a prisoner? It was the silence of peace. The silence that exists between two people when no words are needed because everything is understood." He took a step toward her, his usual grace replaced by a coiled tension. "You speak of being a vessel. You have no idea. You are not a vessel to be filled, Elara. You are the kiln fire. You are the element that changes everything it touches." He stared at her, his chest rising and falling with uncharacteristic rapidity. Then, as if the outburst had drained him, the fire in his eyes banked, replaced by a profound, weary distance. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a beautiful, misunderstanding stranger he had foolishly let too close. Without another word, he turned and walked to his bedroom, closing the door with a soft, final click. Elara stood alone in the vast, dark living room, her own anger evaporated, leaving only a cold, sickening horror. She had taken the most fragile, beautiful understanding that had been growing between them and, in her fear, had smashed it like a flawed piece of greenware on the studio floor. The charged, creative silence they had built was gone, replaced by a new, desolate one. And she had never felt more alone in her life. The echo of his words, "You are the kiln fire," burned in her ears, a testament to what she might have just destroyed. The silence that descended in the wake of their argument was of a different species than the one before. It was not the quiet of strangers coexisting, nor the charged, fertile hush of the studio. This was a frigid, hollow quiet, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air in the penthouse. The open door to the studio was now closed, locked once more. Ji-Hoon retreated into an impenetrable formality, his nods more curt, his presence in shared spaces reduced to the barest minimum. He left earlier, returned later. The shared meals ceased. She would find prepared food in the refrigerator, meticulously boxed and labeled, a courtesy that felt more like a dismissal. He had not forgiven her, and in the stark, unadorned truth of his distance, Elara began to understand the magnitude of her transgression. She had not just questioned his motives, she had rejected the fragile, unspoken language they were building and painted it with the same crude brush as his family's demands. She had mistaken the sanctuary he offered for another gilded cage. Her own world contracted to the four walls of her bedroom, and the city streets she now walked with aimless desperation. The studio, the heart of their brief connection, was now a forbidden organ in the body of the apartment, its absence a constant, throbbing ache. She tried to sing in her room, but her voice came out thin and brittle, collapsing under the weight of her regret. She was a musician without a melody, a bird who had forgotten the shape of its own song. It was on one of these directionless walks, through a park where autumn was beginning to crisp the edges of the leaves, that the past found her. A figure leaned against a familiar oak tree, a saxophone case at his feet. Mateo. His smile was as easy and dazzling as ever, a relic from a life that felt a century old. He was her past, the charming, unreliable musician she had loved with a girl's fervor before her family's collapse had forced a harsh adulthood upon her. He spoke of freedom, of a tour he was putting together on the West Coast, of late-night jam sessions in the open road. He spoke of her voice as if it were a legend waiting to be reclaimed. "You're withering here, Elara," he said, his dark eyes full of a concern that felt performative. "I can see it. Come with me. Get out of this arrangement. Your voice belongs to the world, not to some silent penthouse and a man who treats you like another piece of art on a shelf." His words were a poison and a tonic. They echoed her deepest fears, giving them a charming, sympathetic voice. He painted a picture of escape that was vivid and seductive. The roar of a crowd, the thrill of a moving bus, the liberation of being answerable only to the next note. It was the way out her wounded pride had been screaming for. That night, back in the silent penthouse, the idea took root, fed by the lingering hurt from the dinner and the chilling absence of Ji-Hoon. Perhaps this was all a beautiful, tragic mistake. Perhaps her destiny was not in this quiet, complicated partnership, but in the loud, uncomplicated freedom of the stage. The decision, however, brought no peace, only a frantic, heartsick energy. She began to pack, not with the defiance of her first night, but with a grim, tearful determination. She folded the clothes he had never seen her wear, placed her grandmother's photo carefully atop a pile of sweaters. Her hand paused over the simple linen tunic she often wore in the studio, faint smudges of gray clay still etched into the fabric. A sob caught in her throat. She couldn't take it. It belonged to a different Elara. On what she decided would be her final morning, she found herself drawn not to the front door, but once more to the locked studio. She needed to see it one last time, to say a silent goodbye to the only place in this entire experience where she had felt real. To her shock, the door was unlocked. Pushed open just an inch. A final invitation or a cruel twist of fate. She slipped inside. The room was exactly as she remembered, yet utterly transformed by her grief. The wheel sat still and accusing. The shelves of finished work seemed to watch her. And there, centered on his work table under the beam of the morning sun, was a single vase. It stopped her heart. It was unlike anything she had seen him make before. It was a double vase, two forms, one slightly taller and curving protectively, the other nestled within its arc, that were separate yet designed to be seen as one. They leaned into each other, their curves a conversation, their rims meeting in a suggestion of a kiss. They could not stand upright alone, they required the other's support for balance. The glaze was breathtaking, a deep, midnight blue at the base, swirling up into a cosmic dance of cobalt and violet, with flecks of gold that caught the light like distant stars. It was a masterpiece of silent dependency, of beautiful, necessary interconnection. Beside it, placed inside the curve of the smaller vessel, was a single sheet of hand-lined music paper. Her breath hitched. She picked it up with trembling hands. The notation was precise, a melody for cello, an instrument of deep, resonant sorrow and profound warmth. It was hauntingly beautiful, a composition that spoke of longing, of quiet spaces, and of a hope that was both fragile and enduring. At the bottom, in his precise, architectural handwriting, was a note. "My masterpiece was never the pottery. It was the home I hoped to build with you. The choice to stay must be yours." The paper fluttered from her fingers as her legs gave way. She sank to the floor, the sobs she had been choking back for days finally breaking free, not delicate tears but great, wrenching gasps that tore from the core of her being. Every assumption, every fear, every accusation she had leveled at him crumbled to dust. He had not been shaping her into a vessel. He had been building a home, a partnership, a pair. The silence he valued was not the silence of suppression, but the silence of profound understanding, the space where her music and his art could live together. He had given her a room of her own, a studio to enter, his craft to share, and now this final devastating gift. his own music and the freedom to choose. He had loved her in the only way he knew how, not with grand declarations but with spaces, with trust, with acts of creation that contained his entire soul. And she had been too blind, too scared, too loud in her own pain to hear it. The packed suitcase by her bedroom door now looked like the prop of a coward. Mateo's promises of freedom sounded like the empty noise of a man who had never known what true commitment meant. The only man who had ever been interested in her silence had, in the end, given her the voice of his own heart, written on a page, sealed in clay. And she had almost walked away from it. She didn't know how long she sat on the cold studio floor, the truth washing over her in painful, cleansing waves. But when the tears finally subsided, a new resolve, hard and clear as fired porcelain, took their place. She knew where he would be. She knew where she had to go. The choice was no longer a question. It was the only path forward her soul would allow. She left the suitcase, the packed life, the ghost of an old escape behind. She took only the sheet of music, clutching it to her chest like a map, and walked out into the day, toward the warehouse district, toward the atelier, toward the only man who had ever seen the fire in her and called it home. The city air, usually thick with the scent of exhaust and distant rain, carried a different signature as Elara moved through the warehouse district. It was the faint, clean smell of clay dust and wood smoke, a scent that had woven itself into her subconscious, the olfactory map to a place she now understood was her true north. Her heart was not a frantic drumbeat of fear, but a steady, deep percussion, a grounding rhythm that matched the determined fall of her footsteps on the cracked pavement. The sheet of music in her hand was not paper, it was a lifeline, a contract written in the language of his soul, and her acceptance of its terms was etched into the very set of her shoulders, the clarity in her eyes that no longer looked for an escape, but for a return. The frosted glass door of Kim Atelier was ahead. Through the window she could see the flickering hellish glow from the small high-temperature kiln in the back room, its door sealed. He was firing. He would be monitoring the climb of the heat, a process that demanded absolute attention, a vigil over transformation. She did not hesitate. She pushed the door open, the little bell above it chiming a gentle, incongruous note in the heavy, warm air. He stood with his back to her, dressed in the familiar stained linen, watching the digital readout on the kiln's control panel. His posture was the same as when he worked the wheel, a total absorption. He did not turn. He must have heard the bell, but in the sacred ritual of the fire, perhaps he assumed it was a delivery, an interruption to be tolerated and dismissed. The studio was different. On a large work table laid out with care, were the components of his new series. Not singular vessels but pairs. Interlocking bowls. Two spouted pitchers designed to pour into one another. Sculptural forms where the negative space of one was the exact positive shape of the other. It was a lexicon of partnership, a silent thesis written in clay, composed in the days of their estrangement. Her breath caught. Even in his pain he had been creating their story. She did not call his name. Words had failed them before, had been weaponized. The melody he had written for her was the only speech that mattered now. She walked to the center of the room, where the light from the high window pooled on the concrete floor. She lifted the sheet of music, though she no longer needed to see the notes. They were already inside her, a part of her own rhythm. She closed her eyes, not to shut him out, but to let everything else fall away, the hum of the kiln, the distant traffic, the ghost of Mateo's empty promises, the chilling echo of her own cruel words. And she sang. But it was not singing as the world knew it. It was not performance. It was invocation. She gave voice to his cello melody, but she did not merely vocalize the notes. She became the instrument. Her voice was the bow's pull, the vibration of the string, the resonance of the wooden body. She poured into it every ounce of her understanding, the shame for her blindness, the awe at his patience, the devastating gratitude for his final, freeing gift of choice. She let the melody carry the memory of his hands guiding hers on the wheel, the shared quiet, the electric shock of that first touch in the kitchen. She let it hold the image of the double vase, its beautiful, necessary incompleteness. The sound filled the cavernous studio, weaving around the shelves of pottery, flowing over the pears on the table, meeting the heat radiating from the kiln. It was a sound of homecoming, of a language finally learned, of a choice being declared not with a shout, but with the most profound, vulnerable offering she possessed. Her truth set to the tune of his heart. When the last note faded, a pure, soft silence followed, not empty, but full like the moment after a perfect chord. She opened her eyes. He had turned. He stood before the kiln, its orange light casting dramatic shadows across his face. The controlled mask was utterly gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded landscape of emotion, stunned hope, a vulnerability so deep it made him look young, and a dawning, awestruck realization that shimmered in the sheen of unshed tears in his eyes. He took a step, then another, crossing the space between them as if moving through a dream. He did not speak. He reached for her, his hands, those artist's hands that could command form from formlessness, came up to cradle her face, his touch trembling, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were on her own cheeks. He searched her eyes, and whatever he saw there, the surrender, the certainty, the love, made his own resolve crumble. A low, broken sound escaped him, and he pulled her to him, crushing her against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, not with possession, but with a desperate, grateful anchoring, as if he had been adrift and she was the only shore. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, his breath warm and uneven against her skin. "You are my song," he murmured, the words muffled, thick with emotion, spoken into the sanctuary of her skin. "You are my forever." The seasons turned, not as markers of time served, but as partners in a dance they now choreographed together. The penthouse was unrecognizable. The sterile silence was gone, replaced by a living, breathing soundscape. The rich, complex tones of a cello, Ji-Hoon, having taken up the instrument in earnest to play his own compositions, wove through the spaces, intertwining with the soulful runs and scats from Elara's voice as she composed at the grand piano they had installed where a cold sculpture once stood. Her debut album, Silent Symphony, was a critical sensation, a haunting exploration of love found in quiet places. The final track, Binary Stars, featured a poignant, aching cello melody credited to J.H. Kim. On a bright afternoon, sunlight streamed into their shared studio, now a true collaboration. Finished pieces from their paired series sat beside sheet music for new songs. Elara stood at the wide window, one hand resting on the gentle, impossible curve of her pregnant belly, feeling the soft, insistent flutter of new life within. She was humming a new melody, something that felt like sunlight and deep, quiet joy. His presence warmed her back before his touch did. Ji-Hoon came to stand behind her, his hands coming to rest over hers on her belly, his chin settling on her shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His touch was a sentence, his steady breath against her temple a paragraph. In the profound, passionate quiet they had built, a quiet that was the space between notes in a melody, the peaceful equilibrium of two perfectly balanced forms, the comfortable hush where two hearts beat in synchronized rhythm, every whisper, every touch, every glance was a love poem. Their story, which had begun with a cry against silence, had found its perfect, everlasting harmony within it. They had learned to listen, and in listening had found the only language that was infinite, the one spoken by two souls who had chosen each other forever. If you felt the heat of the kiln and heard the echo of their silent symphony, then join us. Subscribe for more journeys into love stories that speak in whispers, where passion is forged in quiet understanding, and forever is built one unspoken promise at a time. Your next breathtaking adventure in romance awaits.